Dense fog hung over the vast moors of Dartmoor, covering the desolate landscape like a ghostly veil. It was a place of dark stories, haunted by legends of restless spirits and mysterious figures. In the village of Postbridge, a small cluster of isolated houses in the region, the residents lived in constant fear of the Maid of the Mist, a shadowy entity who, according to the stories, lured unwary walkers to their doom in the depths of the moor. In the local pub, known as the Wandering Crow, people avoided talking about her at night. Any mention of the name brought chills and worried looks. Richard Carrow, a skeptical investigator of paranormal phenomena, arrived on Dartmoor on a cold October morning. He didn't believe in ghosts or local legends, and the case of the Maid of the Mist was just another story for him to debunk. Richard, a man in his 40s, was known for his methodical approach and his lack of fear of the supernatural. However, he carried a burden: the recent loss of his wife, Julia, who had mysteriously disappeared on a Dartmoor footpath a year earlier. For Richard, this investigation had a much more personal purpose. He needed answers. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring you more content like this. Now, let's get back to the story. When he entered the pub, he attracted curious and suspicious looks. He sat down at the counter and motioned to the barman, an elderly man called Thomas. "You're here about her, aren't you?" Thomas asked bluntly. Richard raised an eyebrow. "I'm here to find out the truth about this legend. Someone has to put an end to it." The old man shook his head. "Many have tried, none have come back the same. If they have." Richard didn't answer. He felt he was closer than ever to finding out what had happened to Julia. That night, Richard decided to explore the swamp alone, guided only by a flashlight and an insatiable desire for answers. The wind howled between the rocks, and the mist seemed to move like ghostly fingers towards him. For hours, he walked the trails and called Julia's name, hearing only the echo of his own voice. Then, for a brief moment, he saw something. A female figure, shrouded in mist, appearing on the horizon. Her long hair seemed to float around her, and her eyes, as dark as the night, were fixed on him. "Julia!" Richard shouted, running towards the figure. The woman held up a pale finger and pointed to the north, where the treacherous waters of the marsh bubbled up. Richard stopped, feeling goosebumps rise on his skin as the figure disappeared into the mist. He realized that the place where he was standing was dangerous. One false step, and he would sink into the swamp. As he retreated, something unexpected happened. He heard a soft whisper behind him, a voice almost identical to that of his wife. "Richard, come home, before it's too late." The icy fingers of fear began to squeeze his heart. He quickly returned to the village with no answers, but aware that this presence was no simple trick of the mind. The next morning, Richard was approached by a young man called Andrew, who claimed to have seen the Maid of the Mist recently and could help investigate. "I saw the lady last week," said Andrew. "My brother disappeared, and I know she had something to do with it. I want to help find out what's going on." Richard saw in the boy the same determination that he carried towards Julia. "Let's go then," he said, "but it's dangerous. We can't risk it without a plan." Little did they both know that the Maid of the Mist had plans of her own, and no one ever defied her presence without paying a terrible price. The next morning, the village of Postbridge woke up to an even thicker fog than usual. The superstitious residents stayed inside their houses, watching the empty streets through their closed windows. Richard and Andrew gathered at the Wandering Crow, discussing the next steps in confronting the Maid of the Mist. "We need to know where she appears most often," said Richard, as he drew a rough map of the swamp on the table. "You mentioned that you saw her last week. Where exactly?" Andrew pointed to an area on the map known as the Trail of Lament. It was a dangerous region, marked by sharp rocks and treacherous marshland. "That's where it was. My brother Paul disappeared around that bend in the trail," Andrew said, his voice shaking. "I heard him shouting for help, but when I got closer, the mist was so thick that I couldn't see anything." Richard narrowed his eyes and put his hand on the young man's shoulder. We're going to find your brother, or at least we're going to find out what happened to him. We can't let her keep terrorizing people." The two of them prepared a backpack with flashlights, ropes, and a basic supply of food. They set off for the Trail of Lament soon after lunch, despite the warnings of Thomas, who begged them not to challenge the Maid of the Mist. "I've seen strong men come back here like madmen, muttering nonsense," warned Thomas. "Do you think you can beat something that doesn't belong in this world?" Richard ignored the warning. For him, everything had a logical explanation, even the Maid of the Mist. When they reached the trail, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air was heavy, as if an invisible cloak were pressing down on them. Andrew, although hesitant, followed Richard closely. "Listen," Andrew whispered. "Do you hear that?" Richard stopped and concentrated. From within, the mist came indistinct sounds, whispers, as if distant voices were trying to communicate. The voices seemed to be calling out to them, soft and tempting. "That's how she attracts people," Andrew said nervously. "That's how my brother disappeared. He started following these whispers and never came back." "We need to keep a cool head," said Richard, forcing a confident tone. "Let's not get carried away." As they advanced, Richard noticed an object half buried in the ground. He knelt down and dug out an old silver locket. As he opened it, his heart almost stopped. It was Julia's locket, the same one he had given her on their wedding day. "Julia," he murmured, his eyes burning with tears. "You were here." Andrew approached, and before he could say anything, a cold laugh echoed through the mist, icy and devoid of any human emotion. The figure of the Mist Lady appeared again, at a safe distance, her face partially covered by the dense mist. "What do you want?" shouted Richard, raising the medallion as if it were a shield. "Why are you doing this?" The lady didn't answer. She just raised an arm and pointed at the swamp. When the mist cleared for a moment, Richard and Andrew saw something terrible, a body partially emerging from the mud, its fingers pale and immobile. Andrew ran over to it, pulling the body with effort until he realized it was his brother, Paul. "No, it can't be." Andrew fell to his knees as tears rolled down his face. Paul was lifeless, his eyes open and his expression frozen in a mixture of terror and surprise. Richard looked at the Maid of the Mist, seized by an overwhelming hatred. "This ends today," he said, determined. "I won't let anyone else suffer because of you." He then realized that the lady's figure was closer, as if something was forcing her presence to materialize. She held out her pale hand, pointing directly at Richard. "Come, Richard," whispered a female voice that he instantly recognized as Julia's. "No!" he shouted, trying to resist, but something inside him was pulling him irresistibly into the mist, as if his very soul was being drawn in. Andrew held Richard tightly. "Don't look at her, don't pay any attention to her. That's what she wants." But Julia's voice sounded more and more real. "Richard, you abandoned me." Richard faltered, his face marked by pain and regret. "Julia, I never stopped looking for you." The fog began to close in around them, separating them from reality and plunging them both into a formless nightmare. At that moment, Andrew made a desperate decision. He pulled Richard back and shouted, "We have to get out of here now, before she takes us too." As they ran back along the path, the figure of the lady disappeared into the mist, but her presence continued to haunt their hearts. Back in the village, Richard knew that this entity wasn't just a legend. It was a force that fed the fear and despair of the living. And now, he was more determined than ever to face the Mist Lady, whatever the cost. The next day, Richard woke up early. He hadn't slept for more than a few hours, disturbed by Paul's frozen gaze and the sense of helplessness he felt in front of the Maid of the Mist. Andrew, shaken by the loss of his brother, was sitting quietly in the pub, drinking a mug of tea while staring into the void. "We need to act," said Richard, taking a seat opposite Andrew. "We can't let it continue. We have to find out who or what this entity is." Andrew looked at Richard, his eyes swollen with tears. "What if there's nothing we can do? I've seen what it does. It has no mercy. It doesn't—" Richard interrupted him with determination. I lost Julia to that thing. You lost your brother. We've lost enough. We need to understand what's binding this curse to the marsh." Thomas, the pub owner, approached cautiously. "If you really want answers, talk to old Agnes. She lives in the cottage at the end of the Lament Trail. They say she knows the story of the Maid of the Mist better than anyone." Without wasting any time, Richard and Andrew set off in the direction of Agnes's hut. The trail was treacherous, and the mist seemed heavier as they approached. Agnes's hut was small, made of old stone, with dirty windows and a moss-covered roof. When Richard knocked on the door, a hoarse voice echoed from inside. "Come in, I've been expecting you." The two of them entered and found Agnes, an elderly woman with piercing eyes and snow-white hair, sitting in front of a lit fireplace. The smell of burning herbs filled the air. "Do you know the Lady of the Mist?" Richard asked bluntly. Agnes nodded slowly. "I know her. She was once a woman like any other, over 150 years ago. Her name was Evelyn Harrow." The old woman began to tell Evelyn's story, a young woman who lived on Dartmoor, in love with a man called Arthur Clarke. However, Arthur betrayed her and married someone else. Desperate and consumed by hatred, Evelyn wandered the moors one stormy night, calling for Arthur, swearing revenge. But she never returned. That night, Evelyn disappeared, and her body was never found. "They say she threw herself into the marsh, her heart full of hatred," continued Agnes. "Her soul was trapped, and ever since she has lured the unfaithful, the unwary, and the guilt-ridden to their deaths in the treacherous waters." Andrew shuddered as he heard the story. "She lured us using Julia's voice and, my brother, that means she uses despair against you," explained Agnes. "The only way to defeat her is to break the bond that holds her captive." "And how do we do that?" asked Richard anxiously. Agnes held up a small, rusty key. "At the bottom of the swamp, where she disappeared, there is a box containing the remains of her wedding ring. You must find this box and destroy it. Only then can her soul rest." Richard took the key carefully. "But how will we get to the right place in the mist?" "The mist will guide you, but be careful. It will try to stop you getting close." That night, Richard and Andrew returned to the swamp armed with the key, their courage and the desire to put an end to the lady's torment. As they advanced, the mist seemed to pulsate around them like a living thing. Richard held the key tightly, while Andrew kept the flashlight pointed at the treacherous ground. Suddenly, the whispering began again, this time louder and more deafening. A female voice echoed, "Have you come to challenge me? You'll never get out of here alive." Evelyn's figure appeared right in front of them, her eyes as black and empty as an abyss. "Show us the place of your death," shouted Richard. "You paid with your blood," muttered Evelyn, extending her bony hand towards them. Suddenly, Andrew let out a scream as pale hands emerged from the ground and grabbed him by the ankles, pulling him slowly into the mud. Richard rushed to his aid, struggling against the spectral arms that were pulling the young man. He screamed with all his might, "Julia, if you can hear me, help me!" For a moment, a soft light appeared in the mist, and suddenly the arms holding Andrew disappeared. Richard managed to pull him to safety. Gasping, Andrew looked at Richard. Was that Julia?" Richard nodded with tears in his eyes. "She's still here, but we need to finish this." With the help of the light that Julia's presence provided, the two found a spot where the mud seemed darker and deeper. "This is it," Richard whispered, feeling the energy around him change. While Andrew held the rope, Richard used the key to dig through the mud with his hands until he found a small wooden box, soaked and sealed. The instant he grabbed the box, Evelyn appeared a few meters from them, now with an expression of pure hatred. "You can't destroy what I was," she shouted, advancing like a storm of mist and screams. The whole swamp seemed about to swallow them up. The Mist Lady's presence grew like a living storm, enveloping Richard and Andrew in an icy darkness. Spectral hands reached out of the mud and mist, trying to pull them into the depths of the swamp. Richard held the small wooden box, feeling the weight of something much older and more powerful. "Andrew, we need to destroy this box now!" he shouted, trying not to lose his balance on the slippery ground. Andrew, his face pale with fear, nodded and picked up the flashlight. "But how? If we throw it into the water, it might not be enough." Richard looked around desperately until he spotted a nearby rock and decided that brute force would be his only chance. He raised the box above his head and slammed it against the rock. The old wood gave way, cracking with a dry snap. At the same moment, Evelyn let out a scream that made the air vibrate and the mist swirl like a hurricane around them. "No, you have no right." Her voice echoed from all sides, mixed with deep pain and uncontrollable fury. The box opened, and inside was a silver wedding ring corroded by time, along with a strand of yellowed hair and a small note on almost crumbled paper. Richard took the note and read the damp-stained words, "Arthur, my undying love, even in death, I will never forgive you. Evelyn." "Evelyn!" shouted Richard, turning to the raging figure. "You've been betrayed, but your spirit doesn't need to remain trapped in this hatred. Leave it behind and find peace." Evelyn stepped forward, now so close that her dark eyes were like bottomless pits. "Do you think you can save me? I am the mist itself. I am the vengeance and despair that no one can erase." Richard didn't hesitate. He picked up the silver ring and threw it into the mud, where it slowly sank until it disappeared. "This hatred no longer belongs to you," he declared. "You are free to move on, away from this swamp." A heavy silence hung over the place, and for a moment Evelyn's figure stopped, her gaze changing from hatred to a sadness so deep that it seemed to weigh down the air. "I just wanted justice," she whispered. And then, as if she were being blown away, her figure slowly began to dissipate. Andrew held Richard's hand, fearing what would happen next. Suddenly, a soft glow took hold of the spot where Evelyn had disappeared, and the mist began to recede, slowly returning to the edge of the marsh. The weather became clearer, and for the first time in many years, the lament trail seemed safe. Richard felt a gentle hand touch his shoulder, and as he turned, he saw Julia's ethereal figure. Her face was calm and serene, and she seemed at peace. "Julia," Richard murmured, his eyes full of tears. "I never stopped looking for you." She smiled softly. "You set me free, Richard. Now I can rest." And then, with one last loving look, Julia's figure faded into a soft light that spread across the marsh, bringing a feeling of warmth and peace. Andrew watched it all, unable to believe his eyes. It was real. It was all real. Richard took a deep breath, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt for a long time. Yes, it was. But now she's at peace, and the cycle of hatred has been broken. The two of them returned to the village, where Thomas and the other villagers were waiting anxiously. "What happened?" Thomas asked, looking at the two mud-covered and exhausted men. Richard smiled slightly. "The Maid of the Mist won't be coming back. You're safe now." The villagers celebrated quietly, relieved that the curse that haunted Dartmoor was over. However, Richard knew he would never forget the feeling of facing the lady's fury and despair. He decided to leave Dartmoor the next day, feeling that he could finally move on and honor Julia's memory. Andrew, for his part, made a silent vow never again to let the moor consume him in grief, but rather in hope for the life his brother and so many others had lost. Richard decided that before he left Dartmoor for good, he needed to revisit the path where he had last faced the Maid of the Mist. He wanted to feel the peace that his wife seemed to have found and ensure that there were no more traces of the curse. That morning, he and Andrew returned to the swamp. The place, which had once seemed threatening, now exuded an unusual calm. The wind blew gently, and the mist that hung over the vegetation was light, almost welcoming. "It looks like another place," commented Andrew, looking at the horizon with a mixture of relief and amazement. "Evelyn has finally found peace," said Richard. "There's no longer any reason to be afraid here. However, As they moved forward to check where Evelyn's wedding ring had disappeared, Richard noticed something strange in the soil. The earth, which should have been stable, was bubbling slightly, as if there was still some activity below the surface. Richard knelt down and tried to analyze what was happening. "Andrew, bring the flashlight," he asked, moving closer. As they illuminated the area, they saw a spectral hand slowly emerging from the mud, but unlike the other times, this hand didn't look aggressive. Evelyn's figure appeared pale and sad, but without the anger and hatred of before. "Are you still here?" Richard asked, surprised. Evelyn watched him with a pained look. "You freed me from my curse, but not from the pain it left behind." Andrew stepped forward. "What can we do? I thought we were done with all this." "The cycle of revenge is over, but there's something I need," said Evelyn. "I need justice, not just peace. Arthur, he never paid for betraying me." Richard frowned. "Arthur died over 100 years ago. We can't judge him." "But his blood still lives on," whispered Evelyn. "His descendants are still in this village, living as if they had never caused my suffering. They need to know what they've done." Richard exchanged a look with Andrew. It was dangerous to mess with the past, but if this was what Evelyn needed to finally rest, then they couldn't ignore her request. They returned to the village and looked for information about Arthur Clarke's descendants. Thomas, the pub owner, revealed that the Clarke family still lived in one of the oldest properties on Dartmoor, a stone house on top of a hill. Richard and Andrew decided to go up there, even though they felt they were about to touch something that should perhaps remain buried. At the house, they were greeted by Margaret Clarke, a middle-aged woman who looked tough and impassive. "Why are you here?" she asked suspiciously. Richard took a deep breath and explained the story of Evelyn Harrow. He told her about the spirit that roamed the swamp seeking revenge and how they managed to free her from the curse. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Evelyn Harrow? That story has always been used to frighten the children here. Do you really believe that?" "We saw her with our own eyes," said Andrew. "She wants the truth to be known. She suffered because of her ancestors' betrayal." Margaret was silent for a few moments. Then, in a bitter tone, she revealed, "We always knew that Arthur's story was dark. My grandparents said that he had caused the death of a young girl, but we were never sure. Nobody wanted to talk about it." "Now the story needs to be told," Richard insisted. "The truth has power. The Maid of the Mist will only find complete rest if her legacy is known." Margaret took a deep breath, and tears of guilt ran down her face. "Then I will tell the story. I will reveal it to everyone in the village. You have my word." That evening, Margaret gathered the villagers in the main square and told them the truth about Arthur Clarke's betrayal and Evelyn Harrow's suffering. The story, passed down through the generations in fragments, was finally revealed in its entirety. At the end of the narrative, a soft wind blew through the village, and a faint light crossed the square. Evelyn's figure appeared briefly, smiling gratefully. Richard felt a deep peace as he saw her wave gently before disappearing forever. Andrew touched Richard's shoulder. "I think we've done it, don't you?" "Yes," Richard replied. She had finally found what she was looking for: justice and rest. Over the next few days, the village of Postbridge changed. The fear that hung over the moor was replaced by a sense of renewal and hope. The lament trail was renamed Evelyn's Trail, in honor of the woman whose grief had haunted the place for so long. Finally, Richard felt that his role there was over. He said goodbye to Andrew and the other villagers, certain that he could now move on and find his own peace. Richard left the village of Postbridge at dawn. The light mist that had once caused fear now seemed like a tranquil curtain over the trail. As he walked, he took one last look at the spot where he had faced the Maid of the Mist, and finally felt free of the weight he'd been carrying since losing Julia. At the bus station, Andrew made a surprise appearance to say goodbye. "I couldn't let you leave without thanking you for everything," said Andrew, holding out his hand to Richard. "You've helped not only me, but this whole village." Richard shook the boy's hand and smiled slightly. "I just wanted answers. In the end, we all found a little peace." Take good care of yourself here, Andrew. The moor may no longer be haunted, but the memory of it needs to be preserved." Andrew nodded seriously. "I will. Evelyn's trail will be a reminder that no one should be forgotten." Richard boarded the bus, bound for London, feeling like he was leaving a chapter of his life behind. During the journey, he thought of Julia and the last moment he had with her, when her ethereal figure appeared to him on the moor. He knew that she was at peace now, but he also knew that he would never forget the love that had united them. A few weeks later in London, Richard resumed his career as an investigator of supernatural phenomena, but now with a new purpose: to help those who, like Evelyn, were trapped in suffering and hatred. He used the story of the Maid of the Mist to write a book called The Redemption of Evelyn Harrow, which became a success and brought attention to the importance of justice and memory. On the day of the book's launch, he received an unsent letter in familiar handwriting. "Richard, my love, you brought the peace that I couldn't find in life. I will always be with you, in every memory and in every sunset. I love you forever. Julia." Richard felt the tears come, but this time they were tears of relief. He knew he was no longer stuck in the past, but carried Julia's love as a force that would guide him on his future journeys. In the village of Postbridge, Evelyn's trail became a place of peace and reflection. Residents and tourists visited the site not out of fear, but in search of understanding about the story of a woman who, despite being consumed by pain, found her way to redemption. And the mist that was once a symbol of death and doom now seemed to envelop the swamp like a soft embrace, almost as if Evelyn herself were there, watching over and protecting the place that had once made her suffer. The cycle of hatred had been broken, and peace reigned on Dartmoor again. Richard knew he had played his part, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free. 5 years had passed since Richard helped free Evelyn Harrow's soul and brought peace to the village of Postbridge. Much had changed in that time. The trail, once known as the Trail of Lament, had become a famous tourist site where people went not only to enjoy the beauty of the moor, but also to learn about the story of love, betrayal, and redemption that marked that land. Andrew, who had decided to stay in the village, became a kind of guardian of Evelyn's story. He created a small memorial in honor of her and those who had been lost in the mist. His mission was to ensure that no one forgot the past, and at the same time, that no one repeated the mistakes that led to Evelyn's disgrace. At the entrance to the trail, a plaque read, "Here lies the spirit of Evelyn Harrow, a woman who, though consumed by hatred, found peace by seeking the truth." May this story remind us that love and justice go hand in hand, and that forgiveness can break the darkest chains. Richard Carrow, for his part, became known as the Keeper of Lost Souls, a title given to him by the press after the publication of his book on the Maid of the Mist. In his work, he dedicated himself to helping those who carried stories of pain, legends of suffering, and souls who still sought peace. He traveled to different parts of the world, helping to solve cases that no one else dared to tackle. Despite this, the story of Evelyn and Julia remained the most remarkable case of his life. One quiet evening, while resting in his London apartment, Richard received an unexpected visitor. It wasn't a person in the flesh, but the translucent figure of Julia. She appeared in the reflection of his window, smiling softly. "Julia," he whispered, his heart squeezing. "I've just come to say how proud I am of what you've done, Richard. You brought light where there was darkness. I'll always be with you, but now I must go to my eternal rest." He nodded, moved but feeling peace in his words. "You will always be the love of my life." Julia held out her hand, and for a brief moment Richard felt her touch, soft, warm, and real. Then she disappeared like a ray of light lost on the horizon. In that instant, Richard realized that he was truly ready to move on, not just with his work, but with his own life. Some time later, Richard returned to Dartmoor, not to solve a mystery or face a supernatural threat, but to pay homage to everything he had experienced there. He walked along Evelyn's trail and left a small white flower at the edge of the marsh. "Thank you for teaching me the value of redemption," he said quietly. As he turned to leave, he felt a gentle wind wrap around him like a silent farewell hug. Richard left Dartmoor with a light heart, certain that the peace he had brought to that land would accompany him wherever he went. And so the story of the Maid of the Mist, which for so many years had been synonymous with terror, became a reminder of love, justice, and redemption. And the mist that once hid death now hovered gently, like a protective veil over the souls that had finally found their rest. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We'd love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support our work. See you in the next video.